Lucille Ball was born on August 6, 1911, in Jamestown, New York. She began her career in modeling and small film roles before transitioning to radio and then to television, where her work in I Love Lucy, 1951 to 1957, became one of the most influential and recognizable pieces of American entertainment. Ball established Desilu Productions with her husband, Desi Arnaz, overseeing the production of multiple landmark television series. After their divorce, she retained control of the company and became the first woman in the United States to lead a major television studio. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, she worked continuously in television, business management, and industry development. Her public presence was defined by comedic performance, work discipline, and the long-term cultural impact of her programs. In her later years, Lucille Ball reduced her workload. By the 1980s, she made only occasional public appearances and select television interviews. Her final television project, Life with Lucy, 1986, ended after a short run. After this, her public schedule slowed significantly. Ball lived a private life in Beverly Hills, maintaining close contact with her children, Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr., and a small group of long-term personal friends. Her marriage to Gary Martin, which began in 1961, continued through the remainder of her life. In March 1989, Ball made one of her last major public appearances at the Academy Awards, where she appeared unstage with Bob Hope. Observers noted that while she remained composed, her physical condition showed signs of age-related strain. At this time, she was approaching 78 years old. Shortly after this appearance, Ball began experiencing chest pain and discomfort, which prompted her to seek medical evaluation. On April 18, 1989, she was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles due to a dissecting aortic aneurysm. This condition involved a tear in the wall of the aorta, requiring emergency surgical intervention. Ball underwent an extensive, open-heart surgical procedure intended to repair the damaged section of the aorta and stabilize cardiovascular function. The surgery was medically complex and required a prolonged period of post-operative monitoring. After the operation, Ball was placed in a recovery unit under continuous observation. Standard medical protocols at the time involved limiting physical exertion and maintaining controlled visitation to prevent complications. Her immediate post-surgery status was publicly described as stable, and the hospital released formal updates indicating that her recovery would require time and medical supervision. Lucille Ball did not return home during this recovery period. Based on standard cardiac recovery practices of the era, she remained in the hospital to allow for direct monitoring of heart function, circulation, and healing. Media reports during this time focused on official hospital statements rather than direct access to Ball or her family. Because she had long-standing experience managing public attention, her family and medical team kept information structured and limited to essential updates. There were no extended press interactions, interviews, or high-profile visits. The environment surrounding her hospitalization was medical and controlled, not public or ceremonial. During this period, Ball's children and spouse coordinated visitation around hospital guidelines. Her circle of personal contact in her final days was small. There were no large gatherings, reunions, or media appearances. Her care at Cedars-Sinai followed standard protocol for a person her age recovering from major cardiovascular surgery. Monitors tracked her heart rate, blood pressure, oxygenation, and internal healing. Recovery required stillness, reduced stress, and consistent evaluation. The environment was clinical and quiet, reflecting the medical priorities of recovery rather than public engagement. Lucille Ball's condition initially appeared to improve following the surgery. Reports from the hospital during the days after the operation indicated that her vital signs were stable. However, aortic repair in patients of her age carries a risk of sudden complication due to the strain placed on the heart and surrounding blood vessels. While in recovery, Ball experienced a recurrence of aortic rupture. This type of complication typically occurs without extended warning and requires immediate emergency intervention. Despite the response from medical staff, the rupture caused cardiac arrest. Lucille Ball passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center on April 26, 1989. The official cause of death was listed as a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm related to her earlier medical condition. Her death occurred quietly in a hospital setting, with family aware but without the presence of large numbers of people, extended gatherings, or staged farewells. The timeline of events reflected standard medical circumstances rather than dramatized conclusions. Public announcement of her death was issued through formal statements. There were no personal messages released at the time from Ball herself, nor any final interviews or dramatic concluding remarks. Her final days were defined by medical treatment, family presence, and controlled hospital conditions. After Lucille Ball's death on April 26, 1989, public reaction was immediate and extensive, reflecting her influence on television history and American culture. However, the circumstances surrounding her final days remained strictly clinical and private. Many people assumed, based on her public legacy, that her final days included extended family gatherings, public reflection, or highly emotional final interactions. The factual record shows otherwise. Her last days took place within a hospital environment governed by standard medical procedures, supervised visitation rules, and structured monitoring. Family presence was controlled and limited to short intervals intended to minimize stress and preserve her remaining strength. In the months leading up to her heart surgery, Ball had maintained a relatively quiet lifestyle. She was not actively working in film or television. Her public interactions were selective, consisting primarily of social appearances and occasional interviews. She resided in her Beverly Hills home with her husband, Gary Morton. Ball's health had been monitored by medical professionals due to age-related conditions common in individuals nearing 80. However, there was no extended period of public decline. The aortic complication that led to her hospitalization developed rapidly and required emergency treatment rather than long-term planning or anticipated end-of-life care. This stands in contrast to the narrative that often surrounds public figures, where final days are imagined as reflective periods, filled with concluding conversations and symbolic closure. Hospital records and public statements from the time indicate that Ball remained under standard post-operative care, with much of her final week focused on medical stabilization. Her physicians issued concise updates describing her condition as recovering before the sudden rupture occurred. There were no documented interviews or personal messages recorded in the hospital. Communication with the public was handled exclusively through brief official updates from Cedars-Sinai representatives. The environment of her final days was shaped by medical caution rather than emotional ceremony. For patients of her age undergoing aortic repair, breathing assistance, regulated mobility, and restricted interactions are standard protocol. Hospital staff limit exposure to visitors to reduce infection risks and prevent emotional or physical overexertion. Lucille Ball's circumstances followed this medical structure closely. She was not surrounded by media or prolonged social activity. The idea of extensive conversations, final performances of humor, or dramatic goodbyes is inconsistent with the clinical setting in which she spent her last days. The press presence remained outside the hospital rather than inside. Reporters received brief statements based on hospital releases. No private footage, bedside photographs, or interview recordings exist from Ball's final days. Her family maintained a closed communication perimeter, avoiding attention and preventing unauthorized access. This approach was consistent with Ball's established practice of managing the boundaries between her public image and her personal life. Despite decades of intense fame, she had structured her private environment to ensure that family time was shielded from public consumption. Following her passing, her family released a short public statement acknowledging her death and confirming the cause. There were no extended public comments from family members in the immediate aftermath. Her children, Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr., issued their appreciation for public support but did not provide details or personal reflections. This restraint aligned with how the family had handled personal matters throughout Ball's later years. Information remained focused on official announcements, not personal narratives. Public perception of her final days was influenced by her long-standing cultural status. Many fans associated Lucille Ball with humor, emotional warmth, and public affection. As a result, there was speculation that her final days might have included expressions similar to her television persona. In reality, her final days were shaped by medical procedure, quiet observation, and limited interaction. There was no dramatic farewell event, narrative closure, or recorded final message. The simplicity and privacy of her final days contrasted sharply with the large-scale public visibility that had characterized much of her life. In the weeks following her death, tributes focus on her career achievements, the influence of I Love Lucy, and her role in shaping television production through Desilu Studios. Memorials highlighted her contributions to broadcasting technology, comedic performance, and entertainment business leadership. The public conversation centered on her legacy rather than the specifics of her final days. This shift further reinforces the fact that her end-of-life circumstances were private and medically controlled rather than emotionally theatrical. The reality of Lucille Ball's final days reflects a straightforward medical timeline. She experienced a sudden cardiovascular emergency, underwent surgery intended to repair it, appeared to recover initially, and then experienced a fatal rupture. The major elements of her final days were treatment, monitoring, and family presence in a regulated hospital environment. The absence of dramatic narrative closure was not unusual. It was medically typical. Lucille Ball's final days are often remembered incorrectly because her public identity was shaped by decades of visibility, warmth, humor, and cultural presence. Fans projected expectations onto her final moments that matched her television persona rather than the conditions of advanced medical care. The idea that her final days involved extended conversations, emotional closure, or public reflection is not supported by the factual timeline. Her passing followed the medical progression of aortic failure in an elderly patient, emergency intervention, monitored recovery, sudden complication, and a quiet clinical death. The setting was professional, controlled, and private. The narrative that her final days were dramatically different from the reality arises from the contrast between her long-standing public image and the environment in which her life ended. Lucille Ball spent much of her career in front of audiences who identified her with laughter, improvisational timing, and expressive storytelling. However, the final phase of her life was defined by routine medical care, limited movement, and controlled visitation. The environment was shaped by medical professionals whose primary objective was to maintain stability, monitor for complications, and respond to emergent conditions. There were no staged final appearances, scripted remarks, or orchestrated farewells. The privacy surrounding her final days reflected her personal preferences during her later years. While Lucille Ball had spent decades in the public eye, she maintained strong boundaries between her public persona and her private home life. She had reduced her professional schedule significantly in the years leading up to her surgery and had shifted her focus toward family, select social engagements, and personal interests. Her household was structured around familiarity and routine, not performance or public presence. The privacy that existed in her home carried over into the hospital setting by necessity and by choice. Family members continued this approach after her passing. There were no press interviews detailing her final conversations or emotional statements. Her children, Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr., acknowledged the public response to her death but did not offer additional commentary about the final days. They maintained that their mother's legacy should be understood through her wake, her accomplishments, and her influence on the television industry rather than through speculation about her deathbed experience. Following her passing, Lucille Ball was cremated. Her ashes were originally interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. Later, they were moved to Jamestown, New York, to rest alongside her family. The relocation reflected a connection to her place of birth rather than to the public image associated with Hollywood. The decisions surrounding her remains were carried out quietly, without public ceremony. This was consistent with the pattern of privacy that shaped her final years. Public response to her death centered on her cultural legacy. Tributes were broadcast across television networks, newspapers featured retrospectives of her work, and industry figures spoke about her influence on comedy, production, and television distribution. Desilu Productions, the studio she led, had played a critical role in shaping modern television production methods, including multi-camera setup and live audience recording. Her influence extended beyond performance. She had contributed to the structural development of the industry. The focus on her contributions overshadowed the details of her final days because her impact on entertainment history was documented, lasting, and widely acknowledged. The reality of Lucille Ball's final days is a medical timeline rather than a dramatic narrative. She experienced a cardiovascular emergency, underwent surgery in an attempt to correct it, and spent her final days under clinical supervision. The sudden fatal complication was not unusual for her condition and age. The privacy surrounding her final days was consistent with the way she conducted her personal life away from cameras. There were no extraordinary gestures, no final public statements, and no performative concluding moments. Her final days were defined by the ordinary structure of medical care, quiet environment, and family proximity. The phrase, "nothing like we imagine," reflects a gap between public expectation and factual record. Many people assume that cultural icons experience final days that resemble their public roles. In reality, medical processes do not accommodate symbolic closure. Lucille Ball did not perform a final role or leave a scripted farewell message. She spent her final days a way most people do in similar medical circumstances, in recovery, surrounded by controlled care, and removed from public view. Her legacy is built not on how she died, but on how she worked. Her professional contributions reshaped television comedy, production management, and entertainment culture. The factual record of her final days emphasizes that her life ended quietly and privately, without spectacle. This conclusion is not dramatic, but it is accurate. It reflects a final stage defined by medical necessity and personal boundaries rather than public performance.